right. So we're joined here by Olivia Nuss, who is the head of the Student Athlete NIL and the NIL Summit. So why don't you talk a little bit about how you got into that and what that is exactly?
Of course. So I am head of legal and business affairs at Student Athlete NIL. We like to say that Student Athlete NIL kind of has two arms. So we actually function as an agency of record for collectives functioning around specific collectives forming around universities. And then we also have this other arm of athlete empowerment and education through the NIL Summit. So Student Athlete NIL actually runs the NIL Summit. We put it together. We run the show. And this year we actually had administrator tracks and student athlete tracks. So we're not only inviting some of the most influential athletes from all over the country, but we also have over 100 administrators that attended this year who are really interested in doing the best at their school and providing their kids with the most opportunity for NIL. So to the NIL Summit arm, that's our Super Bowl once a year. So I get to engage with all kinds of athletes, again, from all over the country. We had over 500 delegates there this year, and their administrators as well, just educating them on different topics everywhere from, on the admin side, legal liability for a school, what that looks like with Title IX and involved in NIL. What are the legal implications of an institution getting involved in facilitating deals? And then on the athlete track, we have more of how to build your brand, how to advertise yourself and advocate for yourself, how to really build a personal brand and what your core values are in that brand. And then we had some great speakers also come in around finance. So Invesco QQQ was one of our biggest sponsors this year, and they actually did sessions around how to invest, how to file taxes properly, all of that fun stuff that doesn't really get talked about, but is an important part of what we do as a company. So it really gets to showcase all of our different expertise and areas, as well as our partners.
That's great. Yeah. And everything's so new. It's great to have that, that education for, the athletes that are sort of experiencing this stuff for the first time, contracts, all of that kind of stuff.
It's so important. And I think, the schools are required to do education around NIL. I think obviously in any athletic department where you have limited funds or limited abilities, it tends to fall short. But also it's really hard to keep these kids engaged at the age range that they're at, right? I don't know any kid 18 to 22 who can sit and listen in an education session after they've had a 5 a.m. practice and 4 college classes throughout the day. They're checked out, right? So this is really a fun and engaging way for them to be able to participate, to collaborate with their colleagues from all across the United States and really get an understanding of, oh, so-and-so at this school is doing this. Here's how we should implement it in our program. And that obviously helps administrators as well.
Oh yeah. Yeah. So how did you get involved in this to begin with? What drove you to do this work in NIL?
Sure. From a very young age, I have been a creative. I label myself as a creative. I started in digital advertising and graphic design at LSU. That was my undergraduate. And I went to the LSU School of Mass Communication for that, nicknamed the Manship School. They are absolutely wonderful. And I learned everything from graphic design to how to implement a marketing strategy. And I ended up there for my master's as well. For sports related content, I actually started as an LSU bat girl with the baseball team. I'd always loved athletics. I'd always loved baseball. I had a lot of family members involved in baseball. So that's where I got my start. LSU Bat Girls is actually an arm of the LSU Athletics marketing department. So once I had 2 seasons under my belt there, I was actually able to go into the marketing department, and I actually did a lot of design work with LSU basketball for about 2 years. everything from recruiting graphics, like those custom graphics you see when they sign, all the way through to marketing materials or pamphlets for what the players' parents were concerned about, touching on educational benefits and scholarships and all of that fun stuff. So really got to create a niche for myself in athletics communications, and then decided to go to law school. So went to law school, missed the athletic department, missed that world, that high pace environment. So I actually figured out a way to receive law school credit through an NCAA compliance internship within the LSU athletics department. So when I started with compliance, we were still doing traditional NCAA compliance work, which for those of you who are unfamiliar with it, it's essentially the NCAA rule book. It's a rule book of regulations set out by the NCAA that all member institutions opt into. So it's not necessarily law, but it is regulations that they voluntarily choose to follow to be part of the NCAA organizations and tournaments, et cetera. So just around the middle of my internship, which I like to say my full-time job, because anyone who's worked in an athletic department knows it's always a full-time job, we started getting into NIL. And in July, that actually became a possibility for us. So we started seriously planning for the future and creating an NIL strategy for future years at LSU. A lot of it was up in the air when I was there, but I did a lot of the front end planning with who is now the director of NIL over there, Taylor Jacobs. She has been a wonderful role model to me. She taught me so much while I was in that department. We really strategized and came up with the concept of NILSU, which is now their NIL department and program. So I was so lucky to be able to work with her, get some knowledge under her. And then when I graduated, I had to study and take the bar. So went that route, passed the Louisiana bar, and ended up doing some consulting work for some companies that were based here looking for help and strategy with NIL.
That's awesome. So when you had that NCAA rule book and NIL started to come about, what was that evolution like, or what were some of the biggest changes? Like, what was it like being around that, as that was clearly, the road was going to turn a little bit?
Yeah, so it was an interesting time because I don't think anyone knew how to quite approach it. So for those who are unfamiliar, there was a substantial shift in the 2021-2022 calendar years for NCAA enforcement around a student athlete's individual right to their name, image, and likeness. This basically involved a lawsuit. It's NCAA v. Alston in 2022, which basically said that, the NCAA could not limit compensation or any kind of benefit for student athletes. For better words, essentially, the NCAA couldn't limit any cost of attendance at a university. The primary issue in Alston concerned the restrictions that the NCAA had placed on the amount of financial remuneration student athletes could receive. So not necessarily name, image, and likeness, but the court considered the NCAA's limitations on the value of the student athlete's cost of attendance scholarship, which was capped at education-related benefits. So after Alston, the Supreme Court of the United States held that basically the NCAA limiting their financial abilities, which was seen as antitrust violations.
Like an anti-competitive.
Yeah. So it's essentially anti-competitive practice to limit it in that way. So the first real adoption of an interim NIL policy came after state legislation that was released in California, basically stating that hey, we are allowing student athletes to now capitalize on their name, image, and likeness now that that limitation has been seen as antitrust practice. So the NCAA actually adopted their interim policy in anticipation of more states creating legislation around name, image, and likeness. So that policy basically provided that student athletes can engage in NIL activities that are consistent with the law of the state where the school is located without violating any NCAA rules. So they basically implemented this bare bones policy that had two main stipulations. Athletes can't be paid for their on-field performance, which is pay for play now, and schools can't offer NIL deals as a recruiting inducement. Obviously, that is the most highly debated today and highly regulated, and that is still an ongoing battle. But additionally, where athletes were previously prohibited from hiring agents, the NCAA actually allowed student athletes to hire individuals as service providers specifically for NIL. So the interim solution at first seemed to really be a blanket fix for what they knew and anticipated was going to be coming. And as we have seen, state legislation was formed in almost every state across the country and now being revised, and many contradict NCAA policy in many ways. So that's kind of the environment we are in currently.
Yeah. So where do we sit now as far as the states? Are there certain states that exist that are like very restrictive compared to others, or is it all pretty similar at this point?
Absolutely. There are plenty of states that have stricter enforcements than others. The main debate is how involved should a university be and what is the proper role of the institution when it comes to NIL. And because the whole point of name, image, and likeness legislation is to allow a student athlete to go out and capitalize on their name, image, and likeness outside of a university. So many universities have, well, at first, they implemented stricter policies than the NCAA released, thinking that they were getting ahead of the game, and then quickly realized that their legislation was actually hurting their student athletes because the NCAA came out with this bare bones policy and said, follow your state law if you have a state law. If you don't, follow this bare bone policy. So now you have a lot of states rolling back on their prior legislation that maybe said, you know, schools definitively cannot facilitate deals here. Like for example, Louisiana's law used to say that. For example, Alabama, they've completely repealed their law. So it just depends on what their law said, what they've revised it to say, and then the clarifications that have come out since by the NCAA in October have led to a different interpretation of a lot of those laws. However, you have to realize NCAA policy is not law. So again, you have this battle of states that have very restrictive laws. Some of them do not. And they are all following kind of their own method of interpretation because, again, the NCAA regulations, they've voluntarily opted to follow, but their law is now going to trump that NCAA policy.
Yeah. So the NCAA policy not being law, how exactly does that work? It's just that you would be jettisoned from the NCAA, or, you know, that would be like breaking the law. Like you'd have that as your punishment, or, I mean, you'd get like sanctions and stuff, but the worst they could do, I guess, is say you can't compete with these other schools, or.
Right. And so, well, it comes down to who is the policy hurting and who is it intending to punish? Because as of right now, what we know is an athlete's eligibility can be jeopardized from not following these rules correctly. They will obviously come down harder on the schools than the student athletes, I think, in most cases. However, we haven't seen much enforcement around anything NIL so far. So I know certain schools, they want to stick as closely to that policy released in October as they can. Other schools want to push it to their limits as far as they can to see what they can get away with. And I think there's definitely a happy medium to that. I think if you continue to push the envelope, you get in trouble, and that's just how it works. But I don't think that the NCAA policies are going to clarify every question that we currently have.
Sure. Yeah. And speaking of enforcement, there's sort of two arms of NIL. One is sort of the football, basketball, retention, recruiting, payments. And then the other is maybe every other student athlete who's at a school, who's a runner or a gymnast or whatever, trying to get some benefit from their name, image, and likeness. So what are some of the things that you, and you guys just work with the people who are at the schools already who are trying to get benefit from their name,
Correct.
image, and likeness. So what are some of the biggest things that you see are issues for the student athlete, or things that you help with in that regard?
So as far as our company, Student Athlete NIL, the way that it works is we function as the agency of record for collectives that are currently operating at a school. So we come in and we do these start to finish advertising campaigns, creative, all of the tax information.
Is that for the collective or the student athletes?
For the student athletes that sign with the collective.
With the collective, okay.
Right. So the way that, and I don't know how educated your listeners are on collectives, but the way that collectives run, let me rephrase that. The way that collectives should operate and run are to create opportunities for all student athletes at a school. And we pride ourselves in only working with collectives that are the only collective at that school. So we really truly believe that the only way to operate a sustainable collective is to have one collective per university. So you're seeing a lot of different collectives pop up at each university that pertain only to basketball or only to football or only to Olympic sports. We've seen some that are only volleyball, and it's not sustainable in the long run, right? Because you are looking at a donor base who is going to eventually get donor fatigue. They're going to get tired of just contributing money and funds and not receiving anything in return. And so the way that we operate our collectives is essentially like an advertising agency. So any student athlete that signs with our business is going to have a set amount of deliverables based on what the business or brand asks for. So essentially like any other advertising agency or influencer advertising agency would run. So as far as opportunities, they will always have something to advertise and something to do because we have built those brand connections and those relationships through our prior work in order to have that base. So it's less of just donate money, and everyone knows there has to be a quid pro quo for NIL. So you can't just get paid and not do anything for a deal. It has to be a situation where you are getting paid X amount of dollars, and in return, you are giving that brand or that person something comparable in return. So get a lot of private businesses who ask for appearances, that sort of thing. So any appearance that's done is done in a way that is comparable to fair market value for that athlete's appearance.
Yeah, I see.
I hope that answers your question.
Yeah.
But essentially, the way that a collective should operate is like an advertising agency. It shouldn't operate to simply embezzle funds to student athletes for deliverables that none of them are really doing.
Yeah. Just more of a traditional, marketing influencer type of situation.
And that's what it was meant to do, right? Is that,
exactly.
The whole point of capitalizing on your name, image, and likeness is to be able to use it in order to endorse a brand or a company or a product. I have a lot of friends who are student athletes in college who would get approached all the time by either our local Smoothie King or a tanning salon, or if it was a company like Steve Madden, even that big, it would be seen as an NCAA violation, and you could essentially jeopardize your college eligibility by endorsing one of those brands.
Oh
So,
yeah.
so
Yeah,
yeah,
I was a student athlete pre NIL, and I was a runner, and it's like, the local shop would want to give you shoes or want to give you, and it was
right.
like they would lecture you, don't take anything, don't touch anything, don't, you know, because and so it's getting rid of that kind of craziness that I think is good. But then of course people have like pushed the envelope to the max and are now, offering these $9 million deals for somebody to come be a quarterback.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and it happens, right? But obviously those kind of deals get the attention, and those kind of deals also get regulated eventually. And so our goal at our company is to make sure that they are sustainable, they're doing what they're supposed to be doing, and we are communicating properly with their school in order to ensure that they're looped in on that end as well.
And what is the adoption like? Are you seeing like, say you've got, you know, whatever, 20 sports or whatever, like what percentage of athletes are getting NIL deals and and sort of to what degree, like excluding, I guess I would just say excluding like men's and women's basketball and football, like some of those other, if you have 18 people on the volleyball team or whatever, what is it like? How many are actually doing something in NIL?
Yeah, that's a good question. And so I would first premise that by all of our contracts are non-exclusive, so we can't predict the number of opportunities they have outside of the brands and partnerships that we have within
Sure.
the collective. But I would say there's at larger collectives, for example, OU, you would see obviously more traction with female athletes and with Olympic sports in a school like that than you would a smaller size school that doesn't really have as many brands or local businesses around it. So I would say the driver is the local community around that school. And it's dependent on the amount of fans who A, want to give back, but B, the local businesses who see the value in that marketing and advertising. The most successful student athletes that I have seen are the ones that are proactive about going out and marketing themselves, because a lot of female athletes, that's how they're successful. And obviously there is a glaring difference in Olympic sports as compared to men's basketball and men's football. However, it's not impossible, right? There are athletes with 6,000 followers that I work with on a daily basis. And then there are athletes with 115,000 followers that I work with on a daily basis, and their brands are going to look different and their deals are going to look different. However, their exposure is because they have worked that hard to get there, and they are consistent about their brand, about their personal identity, and about posting online.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. Um, well, this has been very informative. Is there anything else you want to add or close with? Or where can people find you?
Yeah, so you can find me on Instagram and on Twitter at ONUSS. I think on Twitter there's an underscore behind there. And then my company is Student Athlete NIL. It's at studentathletenil.com, and then the nilsummit.com. The last thing I would say is, and I always like to ask my guests on my podcast this before we leave, is, a lot of people are skeptical about NIL in general. And I think the best way to handle the skeptics is to show them the numbers and show them the amount of good that athletes are actually doing. Because with any new evolution in college athletics. You're going to have people who try to take advantage of the situation. However, I think it's more important to acknowledge the opportunities that it does bring to kids who would never have an opportunity to probably capitalize on their name, image, and likeness professionally.
Oh yeah, I agree. I think I think overall it's a really good thing. And, obviously, like you said, it being so new and so far reaching, there's going to be the good and the bad.
Absolutely, absolutely. But in the end, I think you will see a plateau of what is currently happening in this environment. I think you will see many more regulations in the future based on the situations that we are dealing with now. And I think enforcement is coming.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you, Olivia. I appreciate it.
Of course.